Selena Kio and Mary Dugan were killed in a double homicide that remained unsolved for decades before being linked through forensic evidence to a known offender. Selena Kio was a teenager living in California in the early 1990s. Mary Dugan was a young woman in her 20s. The two women were not related and did not disappear together, but their cases would later become connected through DNA evidence. In 1993, Selena Kio was reported missing after she failed to return home. She had last been seen in the Sacramento County area. Family members notified authorities when she did not come back as expected. An initial search was conducted, and law enforcement interviewed friends and acquaintances. There were no immediate signs of what had happened to her. Days later, Selena Kio's body was discovered in a remote area. Investigators determined that she had been the victim of homicide. Evidence at the scene indicated that she had been sexually assaulted before her death. An autopsy was conducted, and biological evidence was collected for forensic testing. At the time, DNA technology was limited compared to modern standards. The case was entered into law enforcement databases, but no suspect was identified. Mary Dugan was killed in a separate incident several years earlier. In 1981, she was found deceased in Sacramento County. Investigators determined that she had also been sexually assaulted and murdered. Like the Kio case, biological evidence was collected and preserved. Despite investigative efforts, no arrest was made at the time. Leads were pursued, witnesses were interviewed, and potential suspects were examined, but the case eventually went cold. Over the following years, both cases remained open but unsolved. Evidence collected from each crime scene was stored by authorities. During the 1990s and early 2000s, advancements in forensic science, particularly DNA profiling, allowed cold case investigators to revisit older cases with new technology. Sacramento County investigators began reviewing unsolved sexual assault and homicide cases to determine whether preserved biological evidence could be retested. DNA samples from both the Kio and Dugan cases were submitted for updated forensic analysis. The results indicated that the same unknown male DNA profile was associated with both crime scenes. This established that the two murders were linked. The DNA profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index system, known as CODIS. For several years, no direct match was identified in the database. Investigators continued to monitor the system for potential hits as new offender profiles were added. In 2018, authorities utilized investigative genealogical genetics to pursue the suspect. This method involves comparing crime scene DNA to profiles in public genealogy databases to identify possible relatives of the unknown suspect. Through genealogical analysis, investigators were able to develop a family tree leading to a potential individual. The investigation identified James Dennis D'Angelo, a former police officer, as a suspect. D'Angelo had already been arrested in 2018 in connection with a series of crimes attributed to the Golden State Killer, including multiple homicides and sexual assaults committed across California in the 1970s and 1980s. His arrest was based on DNA evidence obtained through investigative genealogical genetics. Following his arrest, law enforcement compared D'Angelo's DNA profile to other unsolved cases, including the murders of Selena Kio and Mary Dugan. Forensic testing confirmed that D'Angelo's DNA matched the biological evidence recovered from both crime scenes. Investigators concluded that James Dennis D'Angelo was responsible for the murders of Mary Dugan and Selena Kio. The confirmation connected the cases to the broader pattern of crimes attributed to him. Although many of D'Angelo's earlier crimes occurred in the 1970s and 1980s, evidence demonstrated that his criminal activity extended beyond that period. In 2020, James Dennis D'Angelo pled guilty to multiple counts of murder and kidnapping in California as part of a global plea agreement that addressed numerous cases across several counties. The plea agreement resulted in multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The convictions formally resolved many cases that had remained unsolved for decades. Because the murders of Selena Kio and Mary Dugan were linked to D'Angelo through DNA evidence, authorities publicly confirmed his responsibility for those crimes as well. The confirmation provided official closure to the families of the victims, although some charges related to certain cases were impacted by statutes of limitations or plea agreements. Throughout the investigation, law enforcement emphasized the importance of preserving biological evidence in unsolved cases. The successful identification of the perpetrator decades later was made possible by the retention of forensic material collected at the time of the crimes. Advances in DNA testing, including more sensitive analysis techniques and genealogical research, were critical to solving the cases. The Kio and Dugan homicides are among numerous cold cases that were resolved through the arrest and conviction of James DeAngelo. His identification marked one of the most significant breakthroughs in the history of forensic genealogy. The case demonstrated how evolving scientific methods can provide new leads in investigations that had previously reached investigative dead ends. Both victims were young women at the time of their deaths. Mary Dugan was killed in 1981, and Selena Kio was killed in 1993. Their cases remained unsolved for decades until advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to connect the crimes and identify the offender. Sacramento County authorities worked in coordination with state and federal agencies to review evidence and confirm the DNA matches. The confirmation of DeAngelo's involvement officially closed the cases from an investigative standpoint. Law enforcement agencies have stated that cold case reviews continue in jurisdictions across the country, particularly in cases where biological evidence was preserved. The resolution of the Kio and Dugan murders is frequently cited as an example of the long-term value of maintaining evidence and re-examining cases when new technologies become available. The investigation into these homicides spanned multiple decades, involved numerous detectives and forensic analysts, and relied heavily on advancements in DNA science. Although the crimes occurred years apart, forensic analysis ultimately demonstrated that they were committed by the same individual. James Dennis DeAngelo remains incarcerated, serving multiple life sentences. The confirmation of his responsibility for the murders of Selena Kio and Mary Dugan brought official closure to cases that had remained open for many years. The cases illustrate how cold case investigations can evolve over time. Initial investigative efforts in the 1980s and 1990s were limited by available technology. However, preserved evidence allowed later investigators to apply modern techniques that were not available at the time of the crimes. As of today, the murders of Selena Kio and Mary Dugan are classified as solved through DNA evidence linking them to James DeAngelo. The identification was based on forensic confirmation and law enforcement review of preserved biological samples. The resolution came decades after the crimes were committed, following sustained investigative efforts and advancements in forensic science.
Virginia Cecilia Frell was 79 years old at the time of her death in May 1997. She lived in Clay Township, a community in St. Clair County, Michigan. On May 17, 1997, Frell was discovered inside her home by a relative who had grown concerned after not hearing from her. Officers from the Michigan State Police and local law enforcement responded to the residence on that date and found that she had been the victim of a violent crime. Law enforcement officials determined that Frell had been beaten and stabbed to death. The injuries were consistent with a physical assault and homicide. Investigators from the Michigan State Police and the St. Clair County Prosecutor's Office processed the scene for evidence. Physical evidence, including biological material and items consistent with a forced entry, was collected and preserved by detectives. At the time of the initial investigation, forensic technology had limitations in developing detailed DNA profiles from trace evidence. Despite interviews with neighbors and local residents and a neighborhood canvass, detectives were not able to identify a suspect in the weeks and months that followed. No arrests were made, and the case eventually became inactive, classified as a cold case due to the lack of actionable leads. In 2007, the Michigan State Police conducted a cold case review and developed a DNA profile from preserved evidence collected at the crime scene. This profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the National Law Enforcement Database for DNA records. However, the profile did not yield any matches to known offenders in the database at that time. The case remained unresolved for over a decade despite this early forensic work. In 2019, investigators with the Michigan State Police renewed their focus on the Frell case as part of a broader effort to re-examine cold cases using updated scientific methods. New advances in DNA technology and investigative processes had emerged since the early 2000s, and detectives believed that previously collected evidence could yield new leads if reanalyzed. Physical evidence from Frell's home was resubmitted for forensic testing, leveraging improved methods capable of generating more detailed DNA data than had been available earlier in the investigation. The DNA re-examination eventually produced a lead that connected evidence from the Frell crime scene to an individual not previously identified by law enforcement. Investigators obtained information that associated the DNA evidence with a man named John Albert Germain, then 54 years old and living in Hartland Township, Michigan. Law enforcement determined that Germain's DNA profile was linked to material found at the Frell crime scene, providing probable cause for further investigation. On August 2, 2022, Michigan State Police executed an arrest warrant for John Germain at his residence in Hartland Township. He was taken into custody without incident. Prosecutors from the St. Clair County Prosecutor's Office charged him with open murder, first-degree criminal sexual conduct during a felony, and breaking and entering with intent in connection with the May 1997 death of Virginia Frell. Germain was arraigned in the St. Clair County 72nd District Court and held on a $1 million bond pending further court proceedings. Following his arrest, Germain appeared in court where charges were formally presented. The prosecutor's office outlined that DNA evidence from the cold case investigation was a key component in establishing probable cause for Frell's murder charges. First-degree criminal sexual conduct and breaking and entering charges were included in the charging documents because investigators believed that evidence linked Germain to additional criminal conduct associated with the offense. His bonds and court appearances were scheduled through the local judicial system as the case moved forward. Law enforcement officials stated that Germain had family connections in the Clay Township area near where Frell's home was located. The prosecutor's office revealed that investigators collected and evaluated historical information about his activities and associations in the region in the years surrounding the 1997 homicide. The inclusion of DNA evidence enabled detectives to connect Germain to the crime scene in ways that were not possible when the case was first investigated. The development of a DNA profile in 2007 and the subsequent reanalysis in 2019 reflect the evolution of forensic science and its application in cold case investigations. The initial entry into CODIS did not yield a match, but as more DNA profiles have been added to national and state databases over the years, investigators were ultimately able to find a link. This pattern of re-examining cold case evidence with improved technology has been used in numerous investigations nationwide to generate new leads long after the original crime. Police officials have stated that the Frell case illustrates the importance of preserving physical evidence in homicide investigations even when a case goes unsolved for many years. Proper preservation allowed for re-examination decades later when more discriminating DNA methodologies became available. The Michigan State Police's Major Case Unit and forensic labs collaborated on assessing and validating the DNA evidence used to associate Germain with the crime scene. Following Germain's arrest, court proceedings continued as part of the legal process. A probable cause conference and subsequent hearings were scheduled to determine whether the prosecutor's evidence would support formal trial proceedings. The charges filed included both murder and related offenses, based on evidence obtained from both scientific analysis and investigative information developed during the reopened cold case review. The victim, Virginia Cecilia Frell, was 79 years old when she was killed. She lived alone in her Clay Township home, and her death had remained a case without resolution for 25 years until the arrest of Jermaine. Family members and community members had long hoped for answers about what had happened to her, and the reopening of the investigation brought renewed attention to the case within the region. Authorities from the Michigan State Police and the St. Clair County Prosecutor's Office have urged that cold cases such as Frell's benefit from public awareness and cooperation. Tips and historical information from community members can assist investigators in confirming timelines, verifying associations, and corroborating forensic evidence. Over time, investigative files are often revisited to identify overlooked details or pursue new angles that might not have been pursued originally. Because Jermaine's arrest occurred decades after Frell's death, the legal system must balance procedural safeguards with historical evidence. Prosecutors have indicated that considerable effort went into ensuring that DNA and related investigative findings would meet evidentiary standards in court. Defense counsel for Jermaine has had opportunities to review the case and prepare responses to the charges as part of the judicial process. As of the most recent public records, Jermaine remained in custody pending further court proceedings, including preliminary hearings, motions, and potential trial preparation. These legal steps are part of the normal judicial process in felony cases, particularly those involving cold case investigations where evidence spans many years. Prosecutors seek to prove elements of open murder and related charges beyond a reasonable doubt, while the defense may raise procedural and factual challenges to aspects of the investigation or evidence. The case of Virginia Frell's death reflects a long investigative journey from initial crime scene response in 1997 through forensic developments and cold case review spanning more than 20 years. The arrest of John Jermaine in 2022 marked a significant development in a case that had remained unresolved for years, illustrating how persistent investigative work and advances in science can lead to new developments in long-standing cold cases.